Welcome to EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. I'm your host, Russ Roberts of George Mason University and Stanford University's Hoover Institution. Our website is econtalk.org, where you can subscribe, find other episodes, comment on this podcast, and find links and other information related to today's conversation. Our email address is mail@econtalk.org. We'd love to hear from you. My guest today is Dan Klein of George Mason University. Dan is the editor of Econ Journal Watch. Dan, welcome back to EconTalk.
Thank you, Russ.
Dan, our topic today is disagreement and how science and social science arrive at truth and consensus. It's a follow-up to my recent confessional podcast with Robin Hanson. I thought it'd be useful to get your perspective on the issue, and we're taping this on February 5th, 2009. Do you think there's progress in the social sciences? Does the academic enterprise produce more light than heat or more heat than light?
I guess I'm kind of pessimistic about that. I'm not that happy. I mean, I don't think there's any way for people to approach this question, particularly as it concerns the most important things, which are ideological in nature. We're talking about public policy, the way rules in society should be. And I personally don't think it's useful to try to approach the broad question you just asked as though you can somehow separate your own sensibilities about those matters in the way you approach the larger question, the meta question, if you like, that you asked. And that's why I think it's important, to say up front that, I'm one of these people who think that we have too much government intervention. I think the culture is too socially democratic. I think that's a big part of what's going on with the social sciences. I believe that there's a sort of groupthink problem writ large, both in a narrower sense. If you look at the pyramids of individual academic disciplines, history, psychology, sociology, there's a sort of groupthink dynamics going on in each of those. I also would even say, though, that there's a broader society-wide groupthink, which in a sense descended on us with the decline of liberalism, classical liberalism. So my whole take is interwoven with those other sensibilities on this. So my answer is yes, and it's because I see all of these policies and all of these opinions around me that I do think are misguided.
Let me unravel some of that or untangle it, because there's a bunch of different threads in there. And particularly, I want to talk about revealing one's own ideology, and then I want to talk about the groupthink. I've always, I think I mentioned this in a couple other podcasts, but I've always resented it deeply when I'd be labeled as a, quote, conservative economist. One, I'm not particularly conservative, but just the whole idea that I have ideological labels disturbing to me. And because I used to think, and I've had second thoughts about this, as listeners know, but I used to think, look, I have my ideology. Sure, I'm not ashamed of it. I'm not. I don't hide it. But that's distinct from my role as an economist, because as an economist, I'm just a scientist. I'm just seeking out truth. I'm weighing evidence. And yes, it's true that most of the surveys and data that I find convincing seem to confirm my opinion, but that's because those are the good ones. And as listeners will know, I've become sort of more realistic, I think, about my own biases over the years. And I think but I think most economists would disagree with me. I think most economists would say, yes, they hold my original view. Yes, you have your hat as social scientist, and you have your hat as neighborhood across the fence debater on what's the best policy of the day. But I keep those separate. And journalists, for example, I was just talking to some journalists. They say that they like the idea of the same thing. Of course, I vote a particular way every time. Yes, I have a bias internally, but I don't let that affect my reporting, because I'm objective. I'm a journalist. I'm a professional, and a professional knows how not to cheer in the press box. So, except for sports, where there is some cheering in the press box, most people in the media like to think that they're independent, objective seekers of truth. So, what you're suggesting, and I've come to agree with part of it, is that that's naive. It's an illusion. And it goes against what we understand about human nature, which is that we are affected by these emotional and core values, and we shouldn't expect it to be otherwise. Then it only becomes a question of what label I should use. And you, for example, in an article at the Library of Economics and Liberty, have pushed, I think, an interesting label, the Smith-Hayek label for my identity. So it wouldn't sell too well when I'm on National Public Radio, not because of its flavor, but because people have no idea what it is. But if someone said, well, let's hear from Russell Roberts, who's a Smith-Hayek economist, that would be troublesome because most people wouldn't – that doesn't convey anything. But you're suggesting, though, that would be a better world, that we admit and reveal where we're coming from.
Yes, particularly for these broader questions like the one you asked me, which is really a philosophy of science or sociology of science question. Gunnar Myrdal, Nobel Prize winning social democratic economist, not a classical liberal, wrote a book, Objectivity in Social Science, arguing that not only is it legitimate to disclose your ideological sensibilities, but that it's very useful. It alerts the reader to ways that you might be biased. It alerts. It's like a kind of disclosure, like a vested interest kind of disclosure, because after all, ideological sensibilities are commitments that we carry around with us, and are likely to bias. Not just inferences we might make, but formulations of the very problem and selection of the topics, the positions, the arguments that we consider. So he wrote a whole book arguing in favor of ideological disclosure or self-disclosure. Other economists like Frank Graham and recently Peter Lewin have also endorsed this kind of self-disclosure.
But I think if you went around the profession today at the top level, not throughout, but at the top level, meaning if you went to the people that we would consider, that the profession would consider the top 1,000 economists, which would be a huge portion of the people who do influential research, that would overwhelmingly include those folks, and you say, what kind of economist are you? They would say, well, I went to X, where X would be their university. I got a PhD from X. In fact, I just heard someone make this claim, where X is a consensus top 5 PhD program. And he said, well, of course, anyone who goes to X is a well-trained economist and therefore understands what works and what doesn't work. And that's end of story. It's like saying you want a bridge built by an engineer, you get a good engineer, and that's the end of the story. So if you want to fix the economy today in its current situation, you just need somebody well-trained at a good first-rate university. So they wouldn't label themselves, a lot of folks. I think they'd say, I have no ideological bias. I'm just a truth seeker. Do you think I'm right? And what would you do about it if I am?
I think you're generally right. And I think that claim is partly disingenuous when you hear it and partly not just naive.
Self-deception is what part of what you're saying.
Yes, I agree. It's somewhat disingenuous because I think a lot of these guys know that there's certain people they'll hang around with at a cocktail party and others they won't. And it's not necessarily because of who's an economist. It's because of things like ideology and who their sentiments really coordinate with, who really sees the world the same way that they do. It's partly naive because, they see what they've been trained in, the normal science, right? The practices of normal science, the core courses in publishing and the journals. And they don't, I don't think that hard about the norms in normal science and the way those norms have evolved to, exclude certain kinds of arguments, exclude certain kinds of discourse, keep the discussion on what I call between the 40-yard lines, kind of an establishment focus, where anything outside of that, talking about more radical reforms, is somehow being an advocate or being normative or what have you. So I do think there's a lot, and there's ways also just in which I think economic theory is done that eclipse a lot of important ideas, like Hayekian ideas about discovery and the richness of knowledge. So I just think they're naive to a good extent about how normative, as it were, they are in doing what they call positive economics.
Well, let me turn to the groupthink issue because I think that there's a useful way to come out of this discussion into that one. I sometimes, now that I'm more open and honest about this labeling issue, call myself a free market economist, which is a version of the Smith-Hayek identity that is just better understood, in that most people have some idea of what free market means. They may not know what a Smith-Hayek formulation is in your use of it. So one problem with this revelation strategy, this honesty strategy, is that it is then prone to sort of an ad hominem attack. Oh, you're a free market economist. Or you're like Milton Friedman, but he's been discredited, hasn't he, by the recent crisis? Or free markets have been discredited by the recent crisis, and so I find having to cope with that. I put a lot on my shoulders if I take that approach, and it strikes me that the groupthink problem, which I'd like you to elaborate on, is not unrelated to that problem. That a certain cultural cocktail party, who's the right circles phenomenon comes into play when you label yourself, and there's a tendency to want to get be on the good side, have the good label, and so I wonder if those two things are consistent. That is, given the existence of what I think of as groupthink, does that mitigate against the virtue of being honest about your ideology?
Right. Good points. I think there are drawbacks to self-disclosing, and I don't think it's something that you need to overdo. It can rub people the wrong way, and it just can be kind of unnecessary and gratuitous, to be sure. It can also be self-important. A couple of things. One thing is that, starting off by declaring you're a free market economist just could draw you into larger issues, all of a sudden kind of changing the topic. Oh, we thought we were going to talk about the current crisis, and now suddenly you're saying all of free market economics is discredited, and we could talk about, that, which is so much larger, and it just can be distracting. Also, there are issues of groupthink, even sort of within our group. Certainly, groupthink, I think, is a pejorative term. It's pejorative by construction, kind of like rent seeking is. It's groupthink is too much of a readiness among the group to believe what we consider to be defective ideas. The defectiveness of the ideas is essentially being presupposed by the term and by the analysis. Now, even within, free market libertarian circles, our circles or what have you, we can
don't label me, Dan.
Yeah.
I don't fall easily into a box.
Okay. Anyway.
Just humor. I'm sorry.
Even within, groups which have policy judgments like mine, there can be groupthink. Certainly, and it's not so much that the policy judgment is defective, but perhaps the argumentation for it is defective. So you can have groupthink in the argumentation for a sound policy, and that's a kind of groupthink. Think tanks that are kind of hackish or what have you, but maybe you kind of agree with the punchline, the policy punchline, can still very much be immersed in groupthink. So there's groupthink. The groupthink analysis can sort of be directed at the policy judgment, and then also at the argumentation for the policy judgment, and so on. So, and yeah, we all groupthink plagues all of our groups.
Now, you said it's a deliberately pejorative term. Let me defend groupthink for a minute, and then I want to let you counter it. And one of the virtues of groupthink is that it creates it embeds a sort of conservatism, small c conservatism, in the evolution of what is thought to be right. And you could argue that that's a good thing, right? It's better that we aren't all over the place.
That's right.
That we move in small steps. That it should take a big set of new ideas and new evidence before we revise and radically change what we believe. And so, give me your counter to that, and then talk about what you think there is in the academic enterprise, in the university structure, that encourages the wrong kind of groupthink.
Okay. First of all, on the hazards of not having enough groupthink. That's a big Kuhnian theme.
How about Thomas Kuhn?
As in Thomas Kuhn, Kuhn, and I'm thinking not so much of the structure of scientific revolutions, but rather his other work with Deirdre McCloskey so often rightly plays up, The Essential Tension, a selection of essays. He talks about the essential tension between tradition, between keeping to established focal points in science, and innovation, right? And scientific creativity. Like you say, if you allow too much to the latter, it kind of gets all over the place and nothing clearly is focal. The enterprise is no longer coherent. And so there's this essential tension between sort of convention and innovation in science, which I think is quite profound. Now, yeah, I definitely think that we can be too much towards convention, too much towards tradition, too much towards affirming certain things of the group, and in particular, faith in the leaders of the group, faith in the apex of the pyramid, if you will. And well, gee, what makes me believe that we should think this or worry about this is simply that we have economic science supposed to be talking about the most important economic issues, coming to judgments on those. And as I see it, on a lot of important issues, the right answers, as it were, simply are not being arrived at, well formulated, expressed, and conveyed through the ecology of the culture, okay, through like an FDA is a favorite topic of mine. And I think that first of all, the whole apparatus of the whole banned until permitted structure, which really emanates from Congress and the FDA administers, that whole structure is terribly and tragically misguided. And this isn't some private opinion. In fact, so many economists, Milton Friedman, Sam Peltzman, Gary Becker, and many of the scholars who work specifically on the topic reach maybe not the radical conclusion, but certainly express a liberalization conclusion. And when you count noses of all the people who actually express, it's very, very one-sided.
Which side?
Towards liberalization. Of the economists who actually express a policy judgment on the FDA.
You're talking about the Food and Drug Administration. Go ahead.
Right. And specifically, I'm thinking of the control and specifically the permitting of new drugs. They almost all favor liberalization. I could get into more specifics if you wanted to, but so this is a very major conclusion on a super important topic. In some sense, as I see it, these economists who express judgments on the issue, okay, reach a conclusion. And yet, if you poll economists at random, they don't have that view of the FDA. In fact, they're rather supportive of the current. So there's a very significant impasse between the issue expressive economists, if you will.
So-called, you might call them specialists, but they're not just specialists.
That's right.
They include people who are just passionate about the topic.
Yeah, and I don't think we want to discount the Milton Friedman when he has a chapter in Free to Choose. I mean, you don't call him an expert on the FDA, but he's expressing a judgment and making himself accountable to the public for it and his reasons for it. So those issue expressive economists, it's not a very pretty term, but I just don't have a better one. The issue expressive economists often reach a conclusion, particularly in favor of liberalization, much more so than random economists reach a conclusion. And
no, wait a minute, that's not what you.
Yeah,
they reach a conclusion that's different from the mainstream.
That's right.
Than the average economist.
That's right.
It's not just that they're more likely to have a feeling. Right. They have a different feeling.
Yeah. Yes. Although sometimes the average economists are just all over the place, and yes, sort of centered in the middle, and they don't really have a clear consensus at all. But the point is this: there's a number of very important issues I just feel very confident in that are important. It's like a shame. It's almost, like an injustice that the knowledge, the enlightenment is not being held up and getting out.
Okay,
and so we need to look at what is going wrong, right, in the culture.
Okay, so I'm going to put you on the couch.
Yeah.
Maybe you're wrong.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe the FDA is a great thing.
Yeah.
You have some experts at your apex, Milton Friedman, Peltzman, et cetera. Maybe they're wrong, and you're unhappy with the process because it gets to an answer that just happens to be different from yours. What's the source of your confidence that you're
arrogance.
Right? Yeah.
Well, a number of things.
And then you can critique the process that produces the alternative result to your own if you'd like, because that's a useful.
That's right. I mean, that's why we get into, Well, first of all, Russ, there's sort of the entry level argumentation of what are the benefits, what are the costs, what are the rationales for the FDA. And, without delving too much in the details, I don't think there's a good market failure rationale for government intervention here at all.
Economies of scale. No, you can't do your own testing. I've heard this thousands of times. You can't do your own testing. We need an independent body that is not influenced by industry money to test the reliability and safety of drugs, and that's a role for government. I don't have to agree with that.
I agree with
that, but that's the argument.
Except the last part in particular doesn't seem to follow at all. There's nothing that's special about government which recommends them to the task and to dictating, the terms of this independent scrutiny and permission. Well, they give permission. There are good arguments. There are market failure arguments for government activism. And those need to really trace back to arguments about how government in its specialness brings something to the problem which otherwise is lacking. And generally speaking, that specialness is its coercive power. And so if there's externalities, maybe there's real externalities to doing basic science, basic scientific research, and it's something we'll otherwise free ride on. That to me mounts to a good, meaningful market failure argument for government intervention, because what the government can bring, its power to tax, to pay for this, as a plausible, theory about a correction. But in the FDA case and in other so-called consumer protection policies, the government actually doesn't bring anything to the table. I mean, sure, the market might be imperfect. Right? It might not be the blackboard perfection and all that, but the rationale has to go more further than that. It has to explain how government in its specialness brings something to the problem to correct this. And in the FDA, occupational licensing, and others, I don't see that there's any argument for that at all. Now, so we can get into these, ground level details.
Yeah, I don't want
right?
to get to them. Let's stay away
and then
from
you
that.
can talk about all the evidence and all the other stuff and all the costs and damage and tragedy of suppressing drug development.
Which I'm very sympathetic to, but I want to avoid the FDA per se, and let's turn to this issue of why you think the academic enterprise.
Let me just can I just finish on the FDA at the higher level? Go to the next level, because so. I can turn to all these figures, the Milton Friedmans and the Sam Peltzmans and the Paul Rubins and John Calfees and all Alex Tabaroxes and all of these guys who do this, make their case, spell it out.
Right.
But, on the other side, there's not much at all there. You say, well, what happens when the other side puts up their case but it's really, you go look for it.
There's that recent book by, what's her name, Angel, I forget her first name, but a doctor wrote a book in defense of the FDA.
Okay, I have to confess, I'm confining this to economists.
Okay. Yeah, you're right. There aren't a lot of economists who write.
No. And you can say, well, economists have their own stupid groupthink, and it's the sociologists who get it right. I mean, we do that to them. So yeah, you're right. The thing is, when you go up, we do start picking and choosing in ways that do, again, invoke our own choices, our own judgments. And that's why I say there's no way out of this.
Right. Honesty, that was better than none.
Shall we get to academic structures?
Yeah, talk about. It's a great point you make about the FDA. I haven't really thought about it. I think the quote other side, those who think the FDA plays a crucial role in improving human health, tend to take it as a given. They don't quantify it. Although maybe in a minute we'll talk about what role empirical evidence might have in this debate. But I'm interested in your thoughts on the sort of the sociology of academic life and why you think that, again, You and I are in a very much minority opinion about the value of non-quantitative work in economics. We tend to be much more enthusiastic about non-mathematical work and much more skeptical about the virtues of mathematics than the mainstream is in the profession. One possibility is we're wrong, we're misguided. The other is that the profession has set up a set of incentives and rewards that makes it harder for our side to get a hearing. And I think you're sympathetic to that latter view. Is that true?
I am, but can I take the academic groupthink thing and more in terms of ideology?
Yeah, sure.
I think what you say about methods and being quantitative relates to those, but I'd rather just focus on the ideology first. We are very much of a minority in that sense too. Us free market people. And it's not just we are in economics a minority. The Smith-Hayek contingent is perhaps 10% of the people out there. But then when you go to the other social sciences, it's basically non-existent. There's practically no free market people, classical liberal people in sociology, history, psychology, and the humanities, philosophy. And to the extent that they are dealing with policy issues in politics, and to the extent that they tend towards a contrary view, which I think it's fair to say they do, I would call it a social democratic view, there's a big problem there. Okay, there's the defectiveness that I talked about as a kind of...
Explain that again.
Well, defectiveness is sort of the starting point for suspecting groupthink, because groupthink, presupposes defectiveness, and you and me talking about this are going to come to sociology and history and so on with a feeling that there's a large defectiveness there. FDR, saved America from laissez-faire in the Great Depression and stuff like that, for example, in history. Not that they all think that or that that's so much an established thing, but it's a quite common view. It certainly is in the public schools and all that, another great realm of groupthink and so on. So why is it? How is it? Or how could it be? Maybe stepping back now from the ideology, but how can it be that defective ideas can persist? Okay, let's not ask how they first get established. Okay, let's assume somehow they can get a focal, a tipping point and get established. How can they persist? I would point to two mechanisms in particular. One's more micro and one's more macro within each discipline. The more micro is what goes on within a department at each university. Departments are very autonomous. They're not taking marching orders from deans and provosts. They very much make their own personnel decisions, which then more or less get rubber stamped. And the way it works within the department, by and large, is majoritarian politics. Now, if a majority has a certain point of view, and if they also believe that sharing that point of view is actually part of the scholarly judgment, okay, which is a very fair belief, as we've been saying, they will, if they're 55% in their hiring, they'll become 60%, and then they're 60% in their hiring, and they become 65%, and I think there's a tendency then at the departmental level for it to go towards uniformity. And heck, Russ, here we are sitting in GMU Econ department, and it's pretty uniform.
It is. It's the only place that's uniform in the direction that it's uniform, that is towards the Smith-Hayek,
at least
classical liberal place.
At its level of status, yeah.
Yeah, and its size. It's not four people who've picked a fifth who agrees with them. It's 20-plus people who all take a similar view toward the correct role, and there's a lot of diversity here, obviously, but
not all. It's not all. I'm sure we have people voting Democratic in this department.
Well, excuse me. I'm sure we have people who vote.
That's right.
There are a lot of people who don't vote because they find the whole enterprise.
That's right. I've never voted Republican.
Yeah, I just want to make it clear. It's not like we're a Republican department. I'm sure there are people who do vote Republican, but it's
there's a preponderance, a mass preponderance
of
a free market,
classically liberal folks here.
And furthermore, while we're at it, I for one do think that the scientific judgment ought to reflect that. If someone's not getting some of those issues what I consider right, I doubt them as an economist.
Right.
Frankly,
But you're in a small group, Dan. Again, right?
In this department, you mean?
No, I mean no. In the world.
In the world, yeah, absolutely. But I'm just saying that I conform to my theory of what happens in departments that way. And so there's this tendency towards uniformity within the department, okay? Now, where does the department look to for its norms and standards of quality, fairness,
excellence,
focal points for all that, and it looks to the established structures of its discipline, okay? And so then there's the wider discipline, which has a pyramidal structure in the rankings of departments. Harvard, Stanford, Princeton, MIT, and what have you are going to be looked up to and followed very much in this way, as well as journals, publishers, and things of that nature. And so you have a pyramid that really leads all of these departments. The history department at a university, the history department for that matter at George Mason University, in an existential sense, is not so much a creature of George Mason University, it is a creature of history. Okay? The historians at George Mason University, whom I hardly know any of, by the way, their identity is much more wrapped up in being a historian than being a George Mason employee.
Sure.
And so if you have we have this pyramidal structure, and if the pyramidal structure goes a certain way ideologically, it's going to sweep people of that ideology into positions throughout the entire pyramid. Another important part of that is the creation, the making and placing of new PhDs. I mean, it's the large departments at the apex of the pyramid who make the most PhDs and who place them the best, and who then go on maybe a little bit an echelon down to be professors and make PhDs. So we have the micro level majoritarian politics within departments tending towards uniformity. And then we have this pyramidal structure throughout the discipline that can lead to uniformity throughout the entire pyramid, so that practically every professor and every history appointment throughout the country comes to be most likely of the ideological ilk that has come to be very much dominant.
That's a rather strange viewpoint although comforting, it's a rather strange viewpoint for a market-oriented person to have. Here we have an industry that is somewhat regulated, but not particularly. There's no, as you say, we're autonomous even within our own university. And I would argue that one of the things that George Mason has done wisely as an economics department is to not try to be a top department like the others. We've decided not to go in the mainstream direction. It's an interesting phenomenon because rankings matter. Being in the top 5 matters, the top 10, the top 20. Only 20 schools can be in the top 20. It's a strange thing. Ruling out ties at the 20th position. And yet most schools from 20 to 50 are vying for excellence. And the way they try to get into the top 20 is to be better at the things that the top 20 schools are already doing very well. So it's a very, in some sense, it's a fool's game. But that's the game that a lot of departments pursue. A department I will not name. I once heard about departmental meetings there where they would not hire so and so because so and so couldn't get a job at MIT. This school is not MIT. It's not in the top 20. It's maybe in the top 40. But since this person would not get a job at MIT, they wouldn't lower themselves and hire this person, even though it might have made their department better. So at George Mason, we've eschewed that strategy. We said we're not going to try to do what everybody else does and do it as well. We're going to do something different from what everybody else does, and we're going to do that as well as we can. And essentially, there's a market opportunity. What some of our colleagues call, the Moneyball strategy of looking for a niche where we can do very well because it's not rewarded by the mainstream pyramid you're talking about. So why doesn't that happen? Why you're suggesting there's a huge market opportunity that people ignore to be part of this apparatus. Why don't they be different, stand out, and excel at something a little bit less mainstream?
That is the big question. let me just gather my thoughts for a second on that. First of all, we're talking about culture. We're not talking about haircuts and toothpaste and so on. And culture itself is very much of a network externalities kind of thing. Furthermore, we're talking about political culture. And so the power of politics, I do think, plays a role in society in general, in terms of creating incentives, creating prestige, creating eminence, creating status. There's also the question of the structure of the institutions that are functioning here, the apparatuses, if you will. And you say it's a free market, but on the other hand, something like 75%, or maybe I think it's more like 70% of college teachers in America are government employees. So it's not exactly a private enterprise economy.
Research money is mostly coming from the government.
Yeah, and so I think there's a whole lot that goes wrong in analogizing the market for historians, the market for economists, with, let's say, the waiter market, waiters at restaurants. I mean, if we imagined a world where waiters had a kind of a job market like economists, right? They would come from a waiter department, right? And waiters would be minted as new PhDs by other waiters, and then, as it were, sold to other waiters. And the demanders of these new waiters are spending money which they're not all that accountable for, and which come from a whole diffuse range of sources, some of which are extracted coercively. So I mean, there's a lot of breakdown in the parallel between sort of the private enterprise labor market for waiters and this cultural market. Of course, there's some parallels, but cultures go wrong. I mean, and then there's all sorts of lock-ins that happen institutionally, and importantly, individually. I mean, we have to keep in mind that when it comes to basic beliefs, particularly about religion and about politics, people rarely change their mind after the age of 25 or 30. This is quite well established. And so it's kind of a taboo, this point. We're not actually supposed to bring it out because we like to kind of carry on our discourse as though we're more open and there's more hope for changing the minds, particularly of our leaders, of the influentials, than there really is. But you know, who are the cultural leaders? It's not going to be the neophytes. It's going to be the people who are locked into their beliefs. And so you can easily have generation after generation locked into bad cultural commitments.
Let me bring up a story that I've been thinking about a lot lately, which is outside of these ideological issues, which I agree. I mean, it's fascinating. It's a separate, we could spend years on it, this whole interface between your philosophy or ideology and then your academic work in history or economics. And we've touched on it a little bit, but I want to bring up a different example, which is the example of Semmelweis. Semmelweis was a doctor who was upset and alarmed and troubled by the fact that so many women were dying in childbirth of puerperal fever, which was a disease that in the last half of the 19th century was a major cause of death of post-delivery women. And Semmelweis had a theory, which of course was true. His theory was that doctors eager to discover the cause of puerperal fever would go to the morgue and examine women who had died in this very painful and horrific way. And then they would go deliver a baby, passing on the fever, the disease via infection to the mother. And that what Semmelweis said would reduce death rates dramatically, and again, he was correct, would be to wash your hands or stay away from the morgue if you were an obstetrician. And the profession did not agree with this. The profession felt that the cause of puerperal fever was vapors or some kind of airborne thing, And their strategy for reducing puerperal fever was to close the windows in the delivery section of the hospital. And there's a wonderful book on this. I've forgotten the author and the name, but I'll put it up on the website for this podcast. And in this book, it describes the fact that Semmelweis, of course, he was sure he was right. The doctors, who were much older and much wiser in their minds than Semmelweis, thought they were right about the windows. So Semmelweis designed an experiment to prove his theory. And I think, at least according to this biography of Semmelweis, he wasn't the most pleasant fellow. So you have which is often the case with renegade thinkers. Often to sustain their viewpoint, they're arrogant and difficult to get along with, maybe other reasons. So Semmelweis wasn't very pleasant. He designed an experiment that he did in sort of a half-hearted way because he knew it was right. And then the experiment showed some inclination that his theory was correct, but because it wasn't done very carefully, it gave an opportunity for the older doctors to dismiss it, which they did. And as a result, thousands of women continued to die until enough time passed, and fortunately Semmelweis's insights weren't lost, and someone younger after a while decided that maybe he was right, and eventually the world came around to his opinion that puerperal fever was not born from outside, but rather from bacteria inside. So it raises, a really troubling and fascinating story about the entire scientific enterprise, not just the social sciences, which we agree have their own unique problems. But in the physical sciences even, it's very difficult for truth to out. Data matters. Empirical evidence does matter, but my memory of Kuhn's structure of scientific revolutions is that major paradigm shifts often occur through the death of the proponents of the old regime who eventually die out and can't impose their incorrect views on the next generation, and the next generation springs up through this cultural phenomenon that we're talking about. They overcome it only because the old guard dies. So what do you think about that?
I think there's a lot of truth to that, and that relates to that lock-in problem. I'm quite sure that books have been written about the Keynesian revolution and about how it was a phenomenon of the new generation. It wasn't so much that the old guard had
convinced,
changed their mind. And I'm quite sure you can say the same thing about the decline of classical liberalism. It wasn't as though, the Herbert Spencers and Auburn Herberts and William Graham Sumners changed their mind about politics. It was that the de Young took up, social democratic worldviews. So I think certainly there's a lot of truth to that. Your story is fascinating. I hadn't heard that story. It's, I guess, an example of iatrogenic malady. That is, I think that's a term, iatrogenic, that it's a malady actually from the treatment, from the doctor, which is an important concept because, we think of social scientists and economists as sort of policy doctors, but really these doctors are are often breeding iatrogenic malady. But anyhow, the thing is, Russ, there's not clear mechanisms. I mean, I'm sure there's some, but there clearly are other mechanisms which are going to tend to prolong and persist in the bad views beyond this generation, because they're the ones who create the next generation in academia.
Yeah.
The people at the top have the most and best graduate students, best at least in a bright, probably industrious sense of the term, who will be best placed and so on. And so it can go on and on in academia.
Are you pessimistic? Let me ask you two questions then. One is just, what role does empirical evidence have to play in this, which is a conversation we've been having, a running conversation we've been having here at EconTalk, and particular sophisticated empirical evidence as opposed to facts. And you're suggesting that there's no Hayekian forces that would make cultures get better. It's a very pessimistic story. Do you have any optimism? Do you have any sources of hope?
I guess I do have some hope, but it's definitely mixed with a lot of pessimism. And it's not that there aren't Hayekian factors and forces, I think there are. I mean, I do think there's certain power to wisdom, if you will, and that always gives it a chance in the fight. But on the other hand, it's not a free market. I mean, that's another thing that has to be kept in mind. Besides the role of coercive taxation and other things, the government is just such a huge cultural player. Okay. I mean, we tend to think of the market as sort of this ever open, infinite kind of space. And so no one players can matter, but the world isn't really an infinite space. It's a finite space in this sense. And governments are just huge cultural players. So if things aren't getting better, it's not necessarily because there are no Hayekian forces. It could just be that they're outmatched, they're overmatched by other forces. Now, I do think there's some hopeful things like EconTalk, and I mean that very seriously. I do think that we have to look for better quality discourse, higher quality discourse. Not that we're so high quality and everything and all that, but there's something about talking plainly, talking back and forth, talking publicly so that we're accountable. That I think all conduces to towards wisdom. And you do a great job inviting, not only people who agree with you ideologically, but also people who don't.
I'd like to get more of them. They're hard to get on. They're a little harder for me to get on the show, but I'd certainly like to get more of them. But let's talk about another aspect of accountability, which is, which I know you're interested in, and that ironically Robin brought up in our conversation, which is prediction markets. I say ironically because we're talking about our biases on this conversation with Robin, and Robin, of course, brings up the thing he's most passionate about, which is prediction markets. But you don't have Robin's direct involvement in that issue. And Robin's a real has been for a long time
a champion. A great pioneer. He's been a real pioneer, theoretically.
Tell me what you learned from the opportunity to use prediction markets that might improve discourse.
I think it's a fascinating thing, and it's clearly a great example of possible sort of meta evidence, possible higher level discourse of the kinds we're looking for here. A great place to start is the Simon Ehrlich bet. Okay.
Describe that.
Paul Ehrlich, famous environmentalist, was on Johnny Carson and all the TV shows on Earth Day with 1,000 journalists saying things are going to get worse, things are going to become scarce, we're going to run out, et cetera, et cetera. And Julian Simon had no attention and was just an economist who thought about markets. And he said, "Sir, if you believe in what you're saying, if you're so smart, you should be rich. If you believe in what you're saying, there should be a profit opportunity in acting on it and somehow buying futures in these things which you say are going to run out. And in particular, you should be willing to bet me that 10 years from now, the prices of resources are going to be higher than they are today after adjusting for inflation." So Simon put out this challenge to Ehrlich, and much to his credit, Ehrlich agreed. And Ehrlich got to pick 5 resources. I think he picked 5 metals that they bet on whether their prices would be higher or lower 10 years later, adjusting for inflation. And in 1990, the bet was finished. The results were in. John Tierney wrote up a tremendous article in the New York Times about it. And Simon won on all 5. And what's important about...
I think it was it $10,000? 1,000. It was a lot of money.
No, it wasn't. It wasn't that much money. And I think the final check and the amount of payment was based on how much the prices moved. And Ehrlich had to pay 500 something to. And in fact, Simon told me he never cashed it. He actually framed it, put it on the wall of his office. But the idea here is that putting your money where your mouth is gives you a much stronger incentive to be responsible and accountable in coming to your judgment. Right. And that's really the idea of prediction markets or betting markets, that people are putting money behind their opinion, and that we would think conduces to more careful opinion making and better opinions in the end. And so that's what Robin is so enthusiastic about, and I think with good reason. Now, I talked to him lately about this to actually brief a little bit, and there are limitations, of course, to this. There's problems in, what you can actually bet on, what kind of metrics you can set up to look at down the line. Another problem with betting markets is that what kind of comparison you should make. Betting markets as compared to whose opinion. There's always going to be some guy who happened to get the last 20 flips of the coin right. And you can say, well, he's the guy that, who really knows.
Genius,
yeah. So who's the expert here? Another interesting issue that he told me about was that they don't pay interest. You got to put your money up front on your bet, but they don't pay interest. So if we're going to bet on temperatures in 2020, and your money would double, from interest compounding alone, but they're not going to give you interest. No one wants to make those bets. So that's a limitation.
That's what the odds are, but that's potentially relevant. I think the bigger problem is for me in these issues is I was thinking about it recently. That'd be great if when you vote on the next big spending package that you're claiming is going to cure the ills of the economy, that your compensation, say, should be based on the unemployment rate that results over the next 6 months. Of course, if we did that, we'd induce a really bad bill because they would do things to lower unemployment, measured unemployment. They'd play to the test. So
you get what you measure.
Yeah, so that would be problematic.
Plus, there's the teasing out problems of, there's so many factors affecting it. By the way, on the interest thing, Robin thinks that maybe regulations, would stand in the way of them, being able to pay interest.
I don't know.
They'd be acting kind of as a financial institution or something. It's possible. I don't know.
Well, let's turn to the Econ Journal Watch, which is a journal that you started and currently edit. Talk about why you started it and how it might, you're hoping at least it could in principle improve the quality of what economists say and are accountable for.
Yeah, the journal engages in a lot of these kinds of innovative kinds of discourse. I think there was a wide open opportunity for this. For one thing, everything is so genteel and polite in academic economics. There's very little real criticism. There's especially of the influentials, of the eminent people. And, I've shaken hands with infamy and I'm ready to criticize them and and others are as well. And so we get criticisms of articles, even in the top journals, sometimes drawing them into response and exchange. We've had a lot of eminent people write for the journal. So you get the back and forth. You get the discovery procedure of dialogue, of debate. Which has very much disappeared in as much as it had ever existed from the top journals. In fact, our own investigations at Econ Journal Watch by Phil Coelho and Jim McClure show that critical commentary has disappeared pretty much from the leading econ journals. Someone writing from down under in Australia showed, by the way, as a follow-up, that it's the same as happened in the Australian economics journals. So there's a lot of opportunity for debate, for criticism. It's basically a journal of criticism of what economists are saying in their work, and also criticism of the institutions and practices of academic economics. And in that sense, a lot of it is sociology. It's sort of the sociology of academic economics. Now, there's one section, all the material is divided into different thematic sections, and there's one section that particularly pertains, and that's, do economists reach a conclusion? And what we do there is we look at what we were talking about before, whether the issue expressive economists who publish judgments on an issue, tend to reach a conclusion. And especially relevant comparison is whether they reach a conclusion relative to random economists. A lot of people say economists don't agree, and they don't. And on a lot of issues, like the FDA, as mentioned, economists are quite supportive of the interventions. But that's only one kind of consultation with the so-called experts, the economists. I think a more meaningful consultation is with these people who publish judgments, because it goes back, just like the Simon Ehrlich bet, just like the betting markets, to incentives in coming to judgment, in publishing judgments, in arguing for judgments, because you make yourself accountable. You make yourself more accountable if you're actually going to publish a judgment about the FDA as opposed to fill out an anonymous questionnaire. And so it's by that theoretical reason, it should be a higher quality conclusion and thinking. And so on a bunch of issues, in fact, the narrower set of economists, the economists who publish judgments, do reach conclusions much more so than the random economists. And that would include the FDA, occupational licensing.
Against.
Yes, all of these conclusions, I should say, they're not, it's not like they're saying abolish and free market but liberalization, okay? Judgments clearly in the direction from the status quo of liberalization. It's some of them more, radical than others, more adamant than others as well. But FDA, licensing, road pricing, rail transit, drug prohibition, postal services, those 6 we've run articles on, and in all 6 of those cases, I think it's fair to say that these issue expressive economists come to a liberalization conclusion much more clearly, preponderantly than the random economists do. Sometimes we have to infer what we think the random economist thinks there. Sometimes we have hard evidence on that. But I think it's fair to think that on those 6 issues. There's a couple of issues where, again, the expert economists, the issue expressive economists reach a clear conclusion: rent control, sports subsidies. But in those cases, the random economist pretty much agrees as well. It reinforces, and I think probably it's stronger. Taxi deregulation is another one that fits in there somewhere. So we do these articles that look at the judgments of economists, and this is extremely important because, in a sense, this is economists coming to a conclusion, and it's something that if there's an impasse with random economists, there's a problem. I mean, why don't economists know the important findings of their own subject? Like why if economists who study the FDA say we should certainly liberalize, why don't the other economists know that? If that's an important conclusion of the science, why isn't the Journal of Economic Perspectives, why isn't the Journal of Economic Literature making it clear that economists who publish judgments think that?
I think the simple answer is that they dismiss it.
Yeah, well, I think going back to the whole groupthink and status quo and being polite and genteel with even the governing structures, the power in society, is part of the problem. And that those crucial journals, aren't willing to be as sacrilegious as they should be. And I do think the Journal of Economic Perspectives has gotten somewhat better under Andrei Schleifer, who's from Russia, so surely he knows about groupthink and government and the academy. But still, I think this is one of the opportunities that I think was open for Econ Journal Watch to be, a little tougher on both economists and on public opinion and on the governing structures. So that's some of what we're doing there.
How successful has it been? Do you have an idea?
Well, it's not clear how you measure success. I feel quite good about it. In fact, I've pursued several kind of wild ideas, and I think this one's the one I can say probably has worked out the best so far. Yeah. No, I feel very good about it. We have 7 Nobel laureates on the advisory committee. We've had a lot of eminent people write for it. I think our readership numbers are very good, and the trends are steadily upwards. We've been indexed. We were selected for indexing by Thomson Reuters, Web of Science, and all that. So
there's hope.
Well, I guess you could say, but then again, there's so many of these.
You're not handing out the issues on, hand copied scraps of paper in dark alleys, and I think there's a tendency of, quote, our side, any minority, to feel oppressed and put upon by the mainstream establishment. And the glass may be a little more half full. One thing I am optimistic about. You're kind to mention EconTalk, but I think there's certainly been, just as there's now much more variety in the media, as cable has allowed entry to be cheaper. I think the blogosphere, I think podcasts have widened the voices that are widely available to people on economic policy, and I think that's all to the good. I think the world's a little more competitive.
I totally agree, and that would be one of the bases for the optimism. Yeah.
So that's good news.
Yeah.
Well, let's close with a philosophical question, and this is a big, maybe a box we shouldn't open, but it's as we're sitting here talking, it's what I've been thinking about in the back of my mind, which is you can think of all kinds of different reasons for why people hold the views that they hold, and you made this fascinating observation that once people turn 25 or 30, they kind of get locked in for whatever reason, either because it's comfortable or they're now wise or self-righteous. Who knows? There are many reasons possibly for that. But I think there's probably a very large disconnect between what we believe and why we say we believe it, or maybe even why we think we believe it. Mm-hmm. So you can think of sort of three broad categories for what causes people to believe what they believe, what they hold to be true. One is we could call evidence, which is empirical work of various kinds. It could be facts, it could be experience, it could be studies, research. The second would be logic, common sense, consistency, etc. The third would be narrow self-interest. That it has nothing to do with those things. It just, you have better friends at the cocktail parties if you hold this view or that view. Have you thought about that triumvirate? And the reason I mention is that when I talk to people about policy issues, like whether the minimum wage is good or bad, or something, I like that example. So, some people will say, "Yeah, I'm against or for the minimum wage because the evidence is blah blah blah," or they'll say, "I just think it's morally wrong that the government intervenes," or they'll say, "I think the government has to intervene because of the injustice of the market." And then there's the third, which is, my friends all believe X, so I'll believe that too. And which of those is true is important, because if you want to change the world, it's useful to know which of those is the reason that people hold the fundamental belief. Because you'll hear people say, we should fight against this regulation because of blah, blah, blah. And I always think, no one's going to be convinced by that argument. That's why you think it's a good argument. It's not why your opponents are holding their view. So have any thoughts on those kind of issues?
Nothing that clear. I think that those categories are not really all that distinct, and trying to make them distinct, I think, could be a mistake. The evidence entails mechanisms and kind of logics about how things work, what the evidence even means, and what you'd look to as evidence. So I would tend to think of those things as all being kind of interconnected. I do think that, and I don't think we should look in ourselves for some, final algorithm, final answer for what it all is based on. Right? I don't think we should look for sort of a foundation. I think that sort of whatever we can articulate as our reasons. This is very Hayekian, Michael Polanyian. Whatever we can articulate as our reasons emerges from deeper, judgment sensibilities that are not yet articulated. And this is a never-ending thing. And in fact, it's a dialectic, because as soon as you articulate reasons, it opens up opportunities to criticize those reasons or refine them or something like that. But anyway, in terms of engaging in debate, I think it's important to try to listen to what the arguments the people you disagree with are saying, and try to work on those. That's why it's so important to get the engagement, right, as opposed to just disengaging and being ignored, which is a big problem. What parts of their beliefs are they putting forward? What claims are they making about the consequences of the minimum wage? that you really might be able to get them to reconsider for either theoretical or kind of more empirical types of reasons. So I don't see any clear and easy answers there. I think we're dealing with statements that are a web and that are sort of 90-something percent true statements is actually what we're working with, in which case, counter examples don't really disprove the claim. I think that's my way is a very Smithian way, actually, of seeing things. I don't know if that helps. Doesn't look like it.
Well, I don't know. I think, I started this conversation with Robin, aware of the fact, really, of my own confirmation bias. And I think most of us don't want to be reminded that we have a confirmation bias. We want to be comfortable holding on to these views. I want to thank the listeners who, in response to the podcast with Robin Hanson, suggested that we talk about the structure of scientific revolutions, which came up in this podcast, and another book, which I think is also relevant, which is A Conflict of Visions, which is Thomas Sowell's, I think, deeply insightful book about how people look at the world and the paradigm that they bring to the filter, the lens, the framework they use to process the facts that we encounter and the evidence we encounter. And I think, as you point out, I think they do all run together. It's a web. It's not really we like to think that they're separate sometimes, but they interact. I want to close with a possibility for our listeners. I'd like to hear from you about this. Before we started the podcast, I was talking to Dan, and he said he was rereading The Theory of Moral Sentiments by Adam Smith. And that's a book that we have available at the Library of Economics and Liberty in its entirety at no charge. And I confess I've never read the whole thing, and I'd like to. And maybe some of you out there would like to as well. So Dan and I are considering a book club where we would, I'm not quite sure how we'd do it, but we would read The Theory of Moral Sentiments, talk about it, and let you either send in via email or other ways your reactions. And so if you're interested in doing that, if you think that would be fun, drop me a note at the mail@econtalk.org address. Anything you want to close with, Dan?
No, just thank you very much, Russ, and everybody for listening.
And thank you. My guest today has been Dan Klein of George Mason University. Thanks for being part of EconTalk. This is EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. For more EconTalk, go to econtalk.org, where you can also comment on today's podcast and find links and readings related to today's conversation. The sound engineer for EconTalk is Rich Goyette. I'm your host, Russ Roberts. Thanks for listening. Talk to you on Monday.